All right, welcome back, everyone, for our third session on the thought of Lebanese Marxist thinker Mahdi Amel. Today, we just want to talk about two essays, one translated by our comrade Ziad, who's with us. So, Ziad, we probably will ask you to weigh in. An essay on the revolutionary thought of Frantz Fanon, which I assume Amel produced after being in the Algerian struggle firsthand. And primarily, there's a series of references to The Wretched of the Earth, but to a sort of wide body of Fanon's writings. Um, I'd be very curious to see how much of Fanon's writings he was familiar with. A couple things I just want to say at the beginning. And then, of course, the other essay we're going to talk about is this very short but very nice piece on the concept of cultural heritage. There's a lot of very interesting things here regarding heritage and imperialism that I found sort of formulated very, very succinctly. But also, I think to talk about the question of heritage, it does necessitate some historical understanding of the Arab Renaissance of the 19th century. And there's this historical dimension that perhaps some comrades could help us fill that in. Because I think, just to say something briefly about that, I had the sense that because we have the problem of national bourgeoisie in these colonized contexts, there becomes an ideological, he says, class ideology emerges as very central to the meaning of culture. And in fact, culture is indistinguishable from class ideology. But moreover, national bourgeoisie wishes to put forward a kind of imaginary, we can think Benedict Anderson notion of imagined communities, I think too, and a sort of an imaginary conception of heritage based upon a civilizational mission, which we know pretty well. The classic Orientalist maneuver. And obviously, Amel is interested in pointing out how this is used for the harmonization of national bourgeoisie for, you could say, almost like the attempt to make coherent their own class project. But because of the structural dynamics involved with the colonial mode of production, which we talked about the first time and the second time of our study group, there are structural impediments to the national bourgeoisie rising to that capacity. So what that means is that heritage becomes a sign or becomes the expression of underdevelopment itself, of stagnation, of regression. And I felt that in that way, in that kind of, it's almost like he's almost giving us a theory of what Lukács would call irrationalism in the destruction of reason, insofar as what the national bourgeoisie produces is a sort of presentist sort of claim upon the restoration of some kind of idea of heritage, which obviously has a sort of educative aspect of trying to reconnect to the people's culture and legacy. But he really thinks this is sort of like a total ruse, and that in a way it must be rejected. I mean, one is reminded here of the way that in the cultural Cold War, the idea of especially since the fall of the USSR, I once traveled to to Central Asia, to the quote unquote Stan region. And it was a fascinating sort of state building project of cultural imperialism, which took all of these various Stan countries, with the exception of Afghanistan for different geopolitical reasons, but say like Uzbekistan, and tried to implement this exoticized conception of heritage to offer some type of palliative identity to transition to transition the culture into adoption of capitalist imperatives, etc. And of course, one of the interesting things about heritage that I think is something I want to discuss on this meeting is, say, in a Muslim majority society, one of the problems that the Soviets had, of course, was that over time, by the time of Khrushchev, it became necessary actually to embrace the propagation of a madrasa system for the kind of furthering and transmission of Islamic madrasas, educational centers. And of course, they centered that in Egypt through Nasser's program. So for a while, Al Azhar itself in Egypt was kind of loosely connected to a kind of broader curriculum that was in concert with Soviet principles and therefore Marxist principles to some extent. But the Soviets always went halfway with that because from the initial Bolshevik Revolution into Muslim majority societies, it was actually quite destructive because the sort of general position was that this is sort of an ossified, oppressive imposition largely on the peasantry, namely Islam. And so if you go to Central Asia, all of the Islamic buildings, not all, but most, were fundamentally destroyed as the Bolsheviks spread south. So that's something I wanted to talk to you guys about. In a way, he has this maxim that I absolutely found resonant with both the essay on Fanon, because the essay on Fanon ends with the question of culture as well, by the way. What's Fanon's theory of culture, right? But he says, becoming precedes being and constitutes its foundation. And there is a way that if the colonial mode of production as this kind of fusional object that we talked about last time produces this state of what I called arrested development or a kind of bad paternalism that must be destroyed, and then the question of revolutionary violence enters there, where it's like the only way to freedom is to destroy this sort of degraded, two times removed quasi mode of production, this kind of right. So the question I think for culture there in this context is sort of like what I guess my question to you all is sort of like what then is cultural revolution in this context? Would be an interesting question in the context of a colonial society. And just to get our bearings straight, Mahdi Amel defines culture as the fundamental mode of being in the world and the concrete form of humanity's presence in the world. Culture is the human universe, even in its material, technical, and economic aspects. Rather, it is immersed in culture, even in its material mode of being. Seen from this angle, the problem of culture appears as the fundamental problem of human existence. And its resolution, in reality, is determined as the end of the realization of the liberation movement of colonized peoples. So this idea of Fanon as keep in point this very important sentence he says is that Fanon has Sartrean flavor or Sartrean influences. We talked last time about the importance of the fused group, but we haven't talked about the importance of the spontaneity of this act of revolutionary violence and the theory that he has here of becoming. But then he says, wait a second, this theory of becoming should not be seen as a kind of immediacy, but it becomes a way for the construction of social reality. He then says that class struggle begins after that. Do you remember him saying that? I found that was obviously what differentiates this from being any kind of anarchist project. It's not an anarchist project, you see. Does that make sense, right? So, okay, now let's move to brief comments regarding historical and revolutionary violence. The theory of Fanon seems to be as follows. Colonial theories of violent emancipation had a kind of impromptu of having the capacity to elevate to be a historical act. But Fanon diagnoses that as imaginary violence, right? It's imaginary violence. And there he adds this dialectical dimension of what he calls a double negation that is at work. A double negation. A negation that is negation of what he calls the violence of everyday life, and a negation that is directed towards the material source of the oppression itself, the colonial mode of production itself. There's a long conversation in here that I want to unpack as well regarding the distinction between the peasants and the industrial proletariat. Now, a lot of this is Mahdi Amel seems, and Ziad, I want your take. He doesn't seem, it seems very context specific. So, in other words, it's not as if we should read this as necessarily fully in line with Fanon's privileging of the peasantry over the industrial proletariat, because it seems to be that he, I'll just read like a passage here. He says, the colonized proletariat, according to Fanon, quote, has everything to lose. The proletariat is the kernel of the colonized people. That is most pampered by the colonial regime. It therefore represents that fraction of the colonized who are indispensable for running the colonial machine. These are the tram drivers, the taxi drivers, the miners, the dockers, the interpreters, and the nurses. These are the elements that make up what we would otherwise call bourgeois, because in a technical sense, they don't have a fully formed bourgeois, right? Okay. Okay. So he seems to be suggesting that that is the reason why it's impossible for them to enter into the status of a becoming historical subject. And the peasantry can more so. Okay. He also says that spontaneous violence is what he calls it produces an undifferentiated unity amongst the entirety of the colonized people. So it's not as if the working class, who technically function, I guess you could say in ideological terms, as bourgeois, won't be affected by spontaneous violence. They still could obviously become allies to uprising and insurrection, etc. Okay. And then he says, as the liberation struggle develops, the deepening of violence and the capacity of revolutionary praxis becomes an imperative. This was a sign that the stage of spontaneity had been sublated. Violence, as an act constitutive of history, now required a meaning that it could only give to itself from within a clear and precise ideological perspective. Therefore, at the first moment of its genesis, it was content to be purely practical consciousness. Now, in order to become truly operative, it tends to find an indispensable foundation in theoretical consciousness. So you see, this is the double negation of this sort of act, which then turns practical in the same way that revolutionary violence, so long as it can overcome and destroy the colonial mode of production, initiates class formation. Because remember from last time, I think this point is a very good one regarding the problem of undifferentiation of the class struggle, and thereby the problem of the impossibility of class consciousness. It seems to be that Fanon is suggesting that after the revolutionary act of violence, class formation and class struggle begins on a new terrain. It doesn't stop. Okay, so that I felt to be very important. And then other things can be stated regarding some basic Fanonian points, but I'll leave it to other comrades to weigh in on those points. Yes, I mean, the other point is that he says, quote, it's the peasantry and the proletariat who achieve capital accumulation, which is the main condition for superseding underdevelopment. And they do this through socialization of production rather than capitalization. Thus, Fanon's judgment of the national bourgeoisie in underdeveloped countries is not based on a moralistic or subjective hatred of them, but on a rational analysis of these classes as historical agents. So that I found interesting apropos the conversation I had with Zahi Zalua on Fanon and Ressentiment, because the rationality of the class struggle here, yeah, it exceeds that sort of, I don't know, acephalic I don't know, hatred or something like that, right? So that I found to be interesting, that class analysis there, which I think he's fully in concert with. I would like to know from Ziad how Mahdi Amel may be moving away from Fanon, or how much he incorporates of Fanon as he goes back to Lebanon after 67 war. When was this essay on Fanon published again, originally, or written, rather?
In 1964.
That's right. Okay. So therefore, it's different than the two-part essay we read before. It's of a completely different conjuncture. Right.
Uh, are you referring to the, I mean, the two-piece essay was written in 1964. In, in when he
The
was,
Fanon essay was written in 64.
uh-huh, yes,
Colonial mode of production essay.
in 68, I believe.
Okay, after 67 war, that's my point.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Because I felt that that one was very particular to Lebanon, to dynamics there, and I was wondering if you saw any break from his Fanonian commitments. Perhaps yes, perhaps not so much. Um, so that's one point. The cultural heritage piece is a lecture that he gave, from what I understand. I also was wondering what the context of this was and what particular agenda he had with it. I have a general sense of this, but I wanted to know the kind of specific um, interlocutors engaged with this polemic, because it does read very much like a kind of, it reads like a clarification as well as a polemic to me, you know? Um, yes, those are some of my main points. Um, Feel free to jump in,
All right.
comrades.
Um,
Please, yeah, please,
should
yes,
I give some
please.
yeah, some history on the cultural heritage one was actually published as a book, but it was quite a polemical way of writing. It was written in response to a big conference that happened in Kuwait in 1974 with a lot of the Arab intelligentsia speaking about the problem of culture, underdevelopment in culture. Um, and the takeaway from a lot of people there was that the problem was that there was an incomplete, a failed Nahda. Nahda is basically the Arab Enlightenment. It takes place in the mid 19th century, keeps going after. There are different elements that begin that affect it, right? Napoleon lands on the shores of Cairo at the end of the 18th century. The Ottoman land reforms that changed the questions of ownership and property. Labor transforms quite a bit in these areas, but you also have the effects of Protestant, Jesuit, other missionaries coming in, seeping in, and that's where the ideas of the French Revolution kind of land in the Arab world. This all gets taken up with the introduction of the printing press. You suddenly have mass publishing, printing, the journal form reappears. So with that, the language itself was transformed, updated, modernized, formalized a bit. So this becomes another massive literary movement. Um, so the problem after 67, some people point that there was an aborted, a failed Nahda in some originary moment that led to deficiencies and so on. So this conference that happened in 74 was one of three where the discussion was about Arab civilization as itself being a problem. So how to deal with it. And Amel's response is a massive rejoinder. This is all, he starts that book with saying, reading the proceeds of this conference, it smells of a Hegelian aroma as he starts taking them down one by one. So yeah, this is the context of the cultural heritage book.
Mhm. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very interesting. This idea of heritage as a presentist form of what he calls thought that is funneled through a class ideology that is attempting to frame social reality. So there's a very philosophical thing going on here, even though he's eschewing Hegel. His big emphasis here is the role of the construction of social reality in the wake of spontaneous revolutionary violence, and the way that national bourgeoisie seeks to impose this question of heritage. Um, Obviously, he has that essay on Islamism and the bourgeois question, which I felt that perhaps, Ziad, you would agree that attempts to develop a kind of national heritage, um, at this point, how does Islamism perhaps fit into this? And what is almost sort of view or critique in that regard? What would you say to that?
So when the Nahda took place, Islam was itself being liberalized a bit. I mean, Islamic reform, starting in Al-Azhar, and other figures who were exiled at the moment were key figures. But throughout time, the question of the role of Islam as a, or the role of the mantle that Islam should take was given a secondary place compared to a form of Arab nationalism, and that became the kind of modus operandi of politics at the time for anti-colonial liberation. That becomes co-opted by the bourgeoisie that Amel speaks about, and so on. So the question of Islam sits in the corner, and then suddenly in the 70s, it starts to percolate. By the 74 conference that Amel is critiques, Islam starts being posited as a solution to the problems, right? We need to embrace some form of authenticity. These culturalist concepts come to the fore in force, and this is before the Iranian Revolution and so on. Of course, after 79, that becomes a massive problem. So his text on there can never be an Islamic mode of production is very much written in response to the kind of the influences, the Islamic influences seeping into resistance, ideas of resistance, becoming desecularized and infused with religious ideas.
Right. And it's very interesting because he's very Marxist in the sense that he's most critical of this idea that the ideology of the heritage building project, whether that be through kind of state sanctioned Islamism, which matures after 79, or secular Arab nationalism, both present an ideological ruse insofar as they give you like a fake idea of progress, which underneath at a materialist level, we know that the colonial mode of production will not be capable of transitioning to what the Heritage Project pretends that it can. So you have this kind of absurd, it's kind of it emerges as an absurdity. And then you have the problem of authenticity as an ideology for a group of people who are subordinated to a mode of production that doesn't. So it becomes a kind of pandered or a kind of fake project in service of the economic status quo, without question. Um, and that's why he says heritage um, almost is almost like this imposition of the imagination of what capital could do if productive forces were permitted to flourish, but they're not. So what you get is in this imaginary uh, sort of nostalgia with the past, but a sense of progress for the people to adhere to in a certain way. So, this is, I suppose, a nice definition of what cultural imperialism is for him, perhaps. He says imperialism had to distort the heritage it conjured in order to make obvious in the mind of the ruling classes and colonized societies the choice between the following: the persistence of heritage as the negation of civilization, on the one hand, and civilization as dependency on imperialism, on the other hand. Indeed, this conjuring preserved specific manifestations of heritage, which, in the logic of imperialist ideology, was used as a means of condemning this heritage when compared to other glamorous manifestations of social reality, which were itself born out of this relation of dependency. So that's very interesting. I suppose my question there is, what is the form of moving away from the civilizational project? Would that be the, I don't know, the kind of resistance from more folk um, forms of ideology amongst the masses, perhaps, that the national bourgeoisie would seek to contain or to reroute? One could also think that perhaps that would be forms of Islamism as well, insofar as you get a kind of dialectic of the National Bourgeois Heritage Project with sort of rival and contesting ideologies below it, right? Um, so that's one question I have, I think, for us as Marxists, which is what are we to do regarding the dialectic of revolution as it pertains to the reconstitution of culture? Um, he's defining culture as an existentialist uh, situation of presence in the world, while at the same time he's rejecting the homage to a theory of authenticity, likely because of this thing you mentioned before, of it feeling like a kind of imposition of what Althusser would call expressive causality, an imposition that is ultimately, I guess, formed in the image of bourgeois individualism. So I think there's that dynamic. Um, but perhaps comrades dug more into the culture section from Fanon and gleaned more insights regarding the Fanonian theory of culture. I know Eduardo has focused a lot on this essay. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And Akshay has worked a lot on Fanon as well, as I believe. I'd like your thoughts on it as well. Um, were you all I guess convinced of Amel's conception here of culture?
I mean, I sort of was convinced, and I saw him using it sort of I don't know if it's specific to Fanon, but in a pretty broadly anthropological sense. And I would say, like, in the sense that it's sort of like cultures, like the individuating situation where things happen. But like, like, if you're thinking about the relations of production in India, like it would involve caste, right? Like, or whatever the situation is somewhere, right? Like in the way that it would be made meaningful in people's lives, it would involve like local names, right? Sort of categories that would name those relations, those antagonisms.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, he tries to draw the distinction. Oh, sorry. He tries to draw the distinction in the conversation on Fanon and culture, that instead of national, we need social and political consciousness. And I had the sense that this um, presupposes some kind of educational project of the Communist Party around, um, yeah, well, like what Engels called counterpower or ideology from below, something like this, right? Um, the other question I think here is the claim is that if the lumpen proletariat is uh, in a curious way, not necessarily, and I would want to verify, I'm not sure about this claim, but it doesn't seem that there is a worry that we often worry about today, or even that Marx worried about in the Brumaire, that the lumpen proletariat in colonized contexts are necessarily so ideologically captured by bourgeois interests. And perhaps that's true because bourgeois interests are ultimately very far from them, because at a superstructural level, the bourgeois mode of production has not advanced, and then perhaps they're more ideologically open to revolutionary ideology. But I'm not sure about that. Otume, please.
Hey everyone, I'm a little under the weather, so I'll be off camera. It is interesting, I mean, to his reading of Fanon, because I've read my Fanon through Fanon, but then through the context of political prisoner struggles here in the United States and their interpretations of him and various other figures. And what I found was a similarity in their reads. Because how I've always understood Fanon in terms of the culture kind of thing is that the importance of the double negation is when you get on the other side of the revolutionary thing, that's when culture will begin, which is why Fanon has not this preciousness of the past, which has gotten him in a lot of trouble with a lot of different sects of Black, various Black nationalists or so forth and so on, different types of sects of, not sects, but different tendencies of thought. But it's not a saying some of them read that as Fanon completely saying yeah, we must abandon it, rather than, it is a growth because I think he acknowledged the same, and then Amel acknowledges that how we look at it is through a distorted Europeanist lens. And I always go back to the final chapter of Wretched of the Earth, the conclusion where he says we cannot copy Europe, right? We must the new humanism, right? Which I also think the next thing with the double negation is quite great because I know people like James Yaki Sales, who wrote a thing with about Wretched of the Earth. He was a political prisoner here in the United States. He's written about how the double negation really is a kind of key dialectical tendency for the colonial subject, because what is that about? It is about negating the the colonizer, but then also, right, you then elevate to the next level, right? And I like the discussion as violence when I took him talking about violence as a unity of opposites. So they're really pointing up the dialectical tendency of Fanon. I really was really into the essay and
Yeah.
showing Fanon as a dialectician. I thought it was really good, and how that the colonial subject awakens is through this understanding of the contradiction, and then the violence is truly becoming in unity and then overcoming it. Um, and I thought it's just very, very strong
Yeah.
read of Fanon that felt very the one thing I will last thing I will say is it's interesting his read of the lumpen and the proletariat question, because in Africa, this is probably Fanon's biggest contention. Many people do not agree with Fanon's read of the proletariat and the peasantry. There are some say he's empirically wrong, when it comes to colonial struggles. But I found Amel's read, and I could be wrong, and I'd be curious what people think. Is that Amel's not saying that he didn't think that Fanon said that the proletariat could not be, but they wouldn't be the first. Essentially, it would come
Hmm.
from the peasantry, and then it would spread to them, which is how I've always read Fanon myself. I didn't believe that there was this thing. He thought the proletariat was completely. There's people who say that, well, Fanon just denies the proletariat can never do anything, and I was like, I don't really agree with that, and
Yeah.
I don't read it in that kind of way. But it was good to read and see his kind of ideas around that.
Yeah. Well, I know that the Fanonian thing also has a sort of Michael Burway, who recently passed away, sociology professor at Berkeley. He's done a lot of work on Fanon, and he has this nice essay where I think he tries to show that there's an ideological rationale also with the intelligentsia having more success regarding revolutionary consciousness with lumpen proletarian populations other than the working class, because, as Amo says, the working class in these conditions, um, I suppose, are have more of a potential for opportunism. I was reviewing my notes from Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, and it's very clear where Amo thinks Fanon becomes a kind of Sartrean. And it's into the idea of the movement away from what he calls the historical dialectic, Sartre does, remember that um, for Sartre, what dialectical materialism had failed to discover was the way of you might call a kind of kinetic potential for what Sartre calls the development of a new rationality, of a real process in the world where the law of appearance and knowledge undergoes a true transformation, or in his language, where a region of being of the class or of the group undergoes what Sartre calls totalization. Totalization, other than the subordination of what capitalism subordinates us to, is what he calls the practico inert. So again, he's trying to think of this theory of dialectics that would be ruptural. They would rupture. They would rupture and open up a new horizon of totalization that could then be, then it becomes the question of how this is held together by the class. And that's where Sartre develops this whole idea of the fused group. So it's this dialectical sort of, kind of process, not stages, but a sort of process. So, this text, I don't know if we have some Fanon scholars who would be able to say how much Fanon really was influenced by the critique of dialectical reason. I don't know that answer myself. Eduardo, please jump in.
So yeah, just given the thesis on national culture from Fanon and Amel, it just reminds me of Mexican history. So in Mexico, it's always struggled, right? Having a kind of nationhood, right? So that national culture. So even since the independence, right? The peasantry was always regional, right? They're always materially, on their own. They had their own, pueblos and mini states in a way. So it wasn't never like a national culture when Mexican independence happened. But given like the material conditions changing, right, especially with the Porfiriato, um, and the revolution, right, which was mostly not necessarily what's called a socialist revolution, more of an anarchist and liberal revolution, right? That's when the notion of national culture came up, right? Especially with education, especially with Jose Vasconcelos, with his concept of the cosmic race, right? And his whole concept of the cosmic race was the Mexicans or Mexico or Mexicans were a mestizo race, right? Which is indigenous and a European. So when Fanon says, this national culture is built on, European relation, right? How you compare yourself with European culture and stuff like that. So Jose Vasconcelos doesn't necessarily negate, right, the indigenous aspect of Mexico, but with this cosmic race idea, right, he's kind of doing that. So from there, right, that's where the Mexican identity kind of forms, right? I feel like it's a false identity, right? Because in reality, how Mexicans view themselves, it's more of a regional thing, right? It was never, it's like Akshay kind of pointed out with India. It's no different in Mexico. You have different languages, different cultures, different aspects of how people live. And materially, right, they can never relate to a past that, Mexican national culture, right, kind of portray itself in history. So that's why Fanon's words about national culture, right, it's false, it's a false thing, right, kind of rings true to me. So yeah, that's kind of my comment on that.
That's very helpful. So this ideology of the Mestizo thing, was this like a kind of like reactionary, like a social Darwinist thing, like it's kind of or a kind of like do you know more about its like origins as a sort of ideology formation?
Definitely. It was kind of like, because, Mexico's never really shaken the race caste, right? They had like mestizo and Indio and African heritage and stuff like that. So it kind of never really erased that. So Vasconcelos kind of just put this idea of cosmic race to kind of just mix everybody together, right?
Mm.
To kind of unite people, and everybody now is going to speak Spanish. Everybody's going to be educated, right? This is how we're going to raise the development of Mexico, right?
Mm.
But again, Mexican development has always been hindered by the United States since the very beginning, right? It's always been not the beginning, but it's always been hindered by the United States,
Yeah.
always invading Mexico in different points of, its history. So, Vasconcelos, with this cosmic race, he was essentially modernizing, right, the Mexican with its backwardness and stuff like that. But again, the people themselves, they never viewed themselves necessarily then or even now sometimes, you know, as that cosmic race, right? So, you know, like I said, Fanon with his or Amel's reading of this, it just rings true.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, there is a certain reminder of even W.E.B. Du Bois's kind of pseudo-universalist Hegelianism that was very common at this time to sort of, kind of index that type of nationalist universalism into these kind of imagined constructs. I just wanted to say one thing. The Sartrean thing is something I've been thinking a lot about in reading this material, insofar as he's talking about authenticity, culture, and exists as a fundamental ground of universal existence. And then he's also talking about the role of culture in revolution. And just to go back to Jean-Paul Sartre, and then we'll go immediately to Ziad, the Jean-Paul Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. Just so you guys are aware, what's very weird about this is that Sartre does not think revolution in the way Amel does in the colonial mode of production essays we've read, insofar as a transition from one mode of production to the other. But he rather starts with the individual and the individual's potential for bonds with what he calls practical ensembles. In other words, it's a prolegomena to a future anthropology. That's what the critique of dialectical reason is, as well as a thought interrogation into a new conception of the dialectic, whereby the whole or the totalizing, the totality is only thought within a negation of regulated collective existence. So this is why he says truth emerges at the moment of these breaks and ruptures. It's an extremely interesting idea. The idea, therefore, also is that history, the conception of history, is a inert interiorization that only appears in fleeting moments of revolt. Okay, that's where I think the Sartrean overlay here is coming into picture. But I think in the Discord, perhaps we might analyze how much Fanon really knew of Sartre. Go ahead, Ziad.
I will. I just wanted. I was inspired by Eduardo's comment just to give some context, but I do want to come back to the Sartrean question in a bit. So when he's writing Amel, when he wrote this in 1964, it was when he went from Lyon to Algeria. Him and his partner were invited by the embassy. Starts being he becomes a teacher, works as a teacher there. But then he starts working in evening committees, trying to think about what to do with the language. Of course, after a brutal decades-long occupation, colonization by the French, the Arabic language and even other languages like the Tamazight were destroyed. The people were deracinated. So there were committees being formed to think about committees for Arabization, how to work on language. So him reading and talking about national culture is quite important here because he writes this, one needs to be worried that national culture must find its way between and against two alienations, a past that immobilizes and a Europe that captivates, and him writing about an Islamic mode of production, and those people who are writing about heritage are precisely for him ones who are captivated by a past. Enlightenment thought is very much one that is obsessed with origins, questions of origins. Just like Napoleon landed in Egypt looking for the Rosetta Stone, so did the Egyptians started looking for their own pharaonic past. So Marxists at the time responded to those people saying, no, we need to look into national culture. The question of culture is forged through proletarian practice, cultural and otherwise. So this is very much where Amel is working. I'll pause here.
So wait.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a little bit more? So what you're suggesting now is a definition of culture that's distinctly Marxist, which we tried to hit at, but which is, we sort of read the definition of culture is defined, just to read it again, as the fundamental mode of being in the world and the concrete form of humanity's presence in the world. The human universe, even in its material, technical, and economic aspects, is essentially a cultural universe.
Mhm.
So it's almost a sense in which he wishes to preserve this kind of like conception from the kind of various assaults upon it, right? Um, yeah, I mean that's
What what
very
what he's
interesting.
writing against is a reified bourgeois notion of culture.
Hmm.
This comes through in his entire book on uh, his critique of the Arab civilizationalist discourse. He says one of the chapters is titled "The Problem is not that the present is stuck in the past, but that the past is finds its way in the present, precisely through these kind of revivalist ideologies of Islam or whatever." So him Fanon resonated for him in Algeria, and very much he carried this in thinking about places like Lebanon, where the entire middle class was formed through missionary education, and they looked at Europe, they looked at, they became Francophiles. We see this in other artistic forms. We see this in theater. We see this in painting, abstraction, and so on. Different
Mm.
discussion. But it's important just to say that the very last public speech that he gave, Mahdi Amel, before he was assassinated, it was called Culture and Revolution. And it's
Oh,
precisely,
I thought that was cultural and heritage. It's
yeah,
different.
yeah.
It's
It's
not
different.
translated.
It's not translated. I can provide like a machine translation for it in the Discord.
Sure.
Like yeah, yeah. And one other thing, Nadia Bouali and I prefer to think about the term turath
Hmm.
as tradition instead of heritage. This is probably a different discussion, but it obfuscates the importance of the question of tradition for the Nahda, which is very much the realm that these intellectuals are dealing with. And it hits differently to think about Amil saying how to appropriate tradition in a materialist way rather than yeah, leave it in a reified image.
Hmm. Hmm. Very interesting. Yeah. I'm reminded of Joseph Massad's very interesting book. I would recommend a series of essays called Islam in Liberalism, where there's a wonderful section on Arab psychoanalysts and Arab Lacanians that he sees as performing this same kind of conception where they sort of foreclose um, any form of subjectivity that would be other than a French subjectivity. And this was sort of one of the themes of Gabriel Tupanamba's book that I found so important about his book is that he's basically saying the same problem haunts the Lacanian field. You cannot think the end of analysis other than a kind of becoming Parisian, subject in some sense. Um, which is interesting because this revolves around this question of like homogeneity and authenticity and the kind of, I mean, I would have liked to see Amo critique authenticity a bit more. He almost seems to not fully reject the concept as like so say thinkers like Adorno would. Is that right, Ziad?
No, he has entire chapters critiquing authenticity in the book. They just shared the tiny
So
section
tell, can
from
you
a
say a little
chapter.
bit, can you say a little bit about that? what he says.
For him, the question of authenticity is a form of kind of ideological, or what he would term like a bourgeois ideological practice, precisely to remove and flatten history and its process by precisely kind of creating and instituting within culture ideas of a past that makes one long for one that precisely come in the way of kind of an emancipatory horizon. Um, I'm gonna try to find the book, and I could perhaps give a bit more if you give me a few minutes.
No, that's excellent, and we would love to get the translation of the final lecture. Um, yes, yeah, I feel as if this is very interesting. This sort of this question of culture, because I'm wondering um, the question of cultural revolution as we typically know it in more advanced industrial societies seems to be irrelevant to a colonial context. Doesn't seem to be like the order of the day, so to speak. So all of those debates that the Bolsheviks had or Chinese Communist Party had on cultural revolution, they're different here precisely because of and this may be where the Sartrean thing becomes so important because of the role of spontaneity. And that was actually one of the things in the Fanon essay that I wanted to raise with you guys. Because okay, well, let me pose it as a question. Was everyone clear about his theory of spontaneity? Because I do think that it's very subtle, where it's not exactly this like embrace of spontaneity, but it's this kind of argument that spontaneity births a sort of new process, a new horizon. And then he quotes the second and third chapters of Wretched of the Earth, which are entitled Grandeur and Weakness of Spontaneity. Well, that's one. That's the second. And then the third is the Trials and Tribulations of National Consciousness. So that was one thing that stuck out to me. Maybe I could sort of read this passage. He says, quote, on page of Ziad's translation, page 8, in exercising violence, even liberating violence, people differentiate themselves. However, this differentiation happens spontaneously in the first instance. History privileges the spontaneity of the masses because the nationalist parties, which constitute the core of popular organization in cities, do not incorporate the necessity of armed struggle in their programs. That was the key point. And again, history, where does history fall? It falls with the masses in revolt. It doesn't fall with the bourgeois, national bourgeois. Fanon's judgment concerning the social status and historical role of the colonized proletariat and lumpen proletariat must be situated at this level of spontaneity. The first moment in the development of revolutionary consciousness, that is, in its immediate and unreflective form. Immediate and unreflective form, placed within the movement of the historical formation of revolutionary consciousness. Fanonian thought presents no contradiction with the historical process of that social reality. On this specific point, his thought corresponds to the conceptual formulation of the immediacy of the historical movement of this social reality in its historical process, and not to the totality of its movement. Thus, in the first instance, Fanon denies any revolutionary potential to the proletariat in the colonized country. This is because, compared to the peasantry, this urban class is privileged. The colonized proletariat, Fanon says, quote, has everything to lose. That's okay, and I already read that post. So is everyone clear on this? I think this starts to make sense. But again, what's interesting to me is so much work is happening at the level of the revolt, it seems to me, whereby it matters a great deal. Empirical incentives matters a great deal. Interest, things like these categories matter a great deal, precisely because and one could reflect on the question of surveillance, state control, and so on as we've progressed in time. for such societies whereby revolt at this time had perhaps more of the power of spontaneity is much more realizable. I was wondering how you felt the arguments regarding spontaneity aged. He says the assertion of the fundamentally peasant character of revolution is legitimate only by virtue of this spontaneity, which defines in the first instance the level at which the revolutionary becoming of the colonized countries develops. However, this process as a totality can only be effectively realized if it encompasses the cities as well. So it must be led by the peasantry, but it must bleed into the cities. And this necessarily tends toward the proletariat. Okay. So it's an insurrectionary theory. There's no way around it. He ends the essay, or part one rather, of fusing Che Guevara with Fanon. I mean, one does feel a bit nostalgic for all of this stuff. Tsume, please.
I mean, the only thing I'll say is if you read counterinsurgency literature, they believe it to be true as well, which is why we have the surveillance state that we have now, right? I mean, this synthesis that Fanon had put together of this spontaneity coming out of it and then bleeding into the cities became a core fundamental theory of insurrection writ large. If you know within these movements. And if you read counterinsurgency literature, they looked at that as well. They read while they watched the Battle of Algiers and things like this. So I'm responding to your question about the aging of it.
Yeah.
I think some people like to go and say like, oh well, it was always empirically wrong, and I was like, no, I think it was for that time. It was very clear this was an effective strategy. Now we have to then reanalyze in this new epoch of the development of the surveillance state, which seems to have come out of a response to that.
Right. And it's also this very much Badiouian idea of passion for the real. Let me read this passage to express what I mean by that. I think this is fucking essential. Page 10. Spontaneity corresponds primarily to the immediacy of the movement of history, not to its totality. And again, I'm thinking that totality is being thought here in this Sartrean idea, okay, which I articulated a moment ago. The lumpen proletariat, like the peasantry, is not revolutionary simply because it is spontaneous. In italics, right? It's spontaneous. So spontaneity is like a super important operator here. But because it becomes so historically. So again, I think what he's trying to do here is shift away from this Hegelian idea of history into this theory of history as a becoming, which is why the next sentence says, becoming precedes being and constitutes its foundation. To privilege a moment by making it absolute is to reduce it to a pure flat statism. That's actually very interesting. So it's not as if we're fetishizing immediacy. So it's not, you see, that's my point I was trying to make earlier. So that's one. And then he says, and to lose sight of the internal dynamic of its dialectic. So again, to privilege a moment by making it absolute is to reduce it to a pure flat statism and to lose sight of the internal dynamic of its dialectic. Very Sartrean point. Because this dialectic is real, it resolves its contradictions within the very historical movement of the formation of revolutionary consciousness. There is therefore a genesis and a development of revolutionary consciousness that can in no way be reduced to its moment of spontaneity. Seen in this light, Fanon's thought lies at the very heart of the historical process of a colonized country, in this case Algeria, whose structure it admirably penetrates. Thus, if the proletariat of underdeveloped countries does not actually appear to be as spontaneously revolutionary on the immediate level of history, this in no way leads to the conclusion that it is not revolutionary in reality. The underdeveloped proletariat becomes revolutionary and cannot but become revolutionary because its historical development is the social process of revolution. The problem is posed in terms of both reality and consciousness. Okay, so we need to unpack all of that regarding these categories of consciousness, which before he had said was subordinate to this kind of undifferentiated quagmire. But then reality, Ziad, reality seems to be this something that emerges in the wake of the revolt, or that the revolt makes reality? It's a process of making reality. I mean, these are societies in which, they're very ripe for revolution, where it's actually quite um the potential is quite um present. It's not as if these are quietistic societies that are necessarily overwhelmed by some state repression per se, right? It's on the horizon, and communist parties have. That's actually a question. Like, is this? Would you agree with that, Ziad? And then we'll go to Akshay. Would you agree with that?
And for sure, and he's not just referring to the Algerian Revolution, he's also thinking about what happens in the Battle of Maysalun. He's thinking about the Arab Revolt in Palestine, I think 1936, where it begins and then it spreads and then the intelligentsia comes in. But of course, there's a rupturous quality to that event. So it very much structures reality itself.
Yeah, exactly. Beautiful. Yes, thank you. Akshay, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally, I also, I didn't read it as like sort of specifically like a theory of like the insurrection in a short term, but like sort of like, I mean, if you're thinking of like colonial resistance in India, right? Like you have like 100 years of like peasant revolts, right, which are not organized kind of in any way before. Then you have like cultural nationalism for another like 100 years, and then you have a political party, right? Like, and none of those is sort of like I mean, in the sense that I don't know. I mean, the line that I found kind of striking was sort of like this reality whose structure is revealed by the revolutionary project that like transpierces it. But yeah, I mean, in the sense that I don't know. I mean, there is something about like that logic of historical becoming and the kind of like coming to consciousness of it. But I think that ties into the thing with culture, right? Like, because as opposed to this like nationalist ideological culture,
Right.
I mean, there is like a material sense in which like any labor power anywhere that is like, you know, comes from a particular place, has a particular set of customs, pre-existing sort of relations of production from which it's like organized. I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's like, and that's sort of like, I could not tell how much Fanon really sort of influences, because like so much of this is sort of like also the Althusserian theory of like a conjunctural reading. And
Right.
like what Fanon seems to do really well with, all of this is like emphasizing that the precisely conjunctural aspect of like, well, what's different in the Antilles, right? Like in this, though the one thing that is different seems to be this notion of movements, right? Like in sort of what is a inner movement internal to a culture. And again,
Right.
like I think this is related to your question of like authenticity, where I mean, I don't think he's saying that there's like, oh, a real Arab culture, we should all be, doing X, Y, Z. But the thing is like, oh, a real basis of social reproduction. Like there are these people who live here. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that is materially true. Yeah, that's all.
No, it's very nice. I mean, it does have a lot of resonance with even Badiou's uh, theory of the uh, uh, immediacy of revolt followed by a naming procedure like this. Okay, we had a strike which spilled out to a wildcat strike. It connected to another strike. It was a spontaneous act, but this spontaneous act becomes the site for some type of assigning of meaning and a new ideological perspective to this, in which the spontaneity is then negated through that reflection of the group in the wake of their act. But all along, the movement of the group from its initial point, they possessed what Amel calls history. So, and then he makes this nice distinction here on 11 between reality and consciousness. And so, in a way, it's nice that we read this because it explains exactly some of these points about the latter part of the second essay on the colonial mode of production regarding the absence of class consciousness. Yes, then he says, by deliberately emphasizing the spontaneity of the masses and underestimating the historical necessity of revolutionary ideology, uh, some readers mystify Fanon's thought to destroy its powerful revolutionary ferment. Uh-huh. I see. So yeah, that's actually the heart of it, isn't it? He's trying to make a defense of this deeply dialectical conception of spontaneity that's implicit in Fanon's thought. Yeah, okay. Mutume, please. And then I think we'll maybe wrap up a little soon-ish if comrades are but please, Mutume.
So I think on 17, we might have read it already, but there's this line. Therefore, we must not view the past as a corpse whose memory we invoke nostalgically. Rather, look at it with today's eyes, illuminating it and understanding it in terms of our current revolutionary project. After all, the past can only draw life from its active relation with our present. The only way to bring the past to life is to unite it with our present and extend it to our future. So this is to me always has been the core of the Fanonian practice because there is an acknowledgement of the past, but the multiple pasts, right? The historical past of the colony, but then also the colonization. What actually happened in that and the transformation that happened there, right? And then once the revolution happens, you would then go into the next process. And what I've always understood about the Fanonian thing, about the kind of the transformation that happens through the act, is that something will be imprinted upon you as you do it. What I really liked about what Amel talked about also was the idea of also though that there will be a class struggle after, and I do think that goes in line with Fanon, because I think Fanon, with his comments on national bourgeoisie and the people who he will know will always still be there, right? He knows another struggle will happen, and then a cultural process will develop out of that struggle with the past that you don't um use hagiography or various types of idealized looks of it, but understand it's imprinted upon you. And that is the double negation, right? There's always that imprint upon you as you leave a piece of it and as you go. So I think that to me was really a succinct look at a kind of a Fanonian read of moving towards the future.
That's very helpful. I 100% agree with that. And I'm looking at page 17 as well, and I'm made curious, Ziad, here regarding his idea of a genuine reconciliation with national culture, because it's not as if he's sort of poo-pooing national culture totally. He's trying to articulate a socialistic route. And you see, like, I'll just give you an example. He says, speaking now of the possibility of a reconciliation with oneself and this idea of unifying with a national culture, uh, the current situation he identifies as tragic, but perhaps he then elaborates what a more revolutionary form of national culture might be. He says, although national culture is situated on a plane of alienation, this first moment in the genesis of national culture, seen from the perspective of its historical formation, constitutes, as it were, the last moment in the prehistory of this culture, and the necessary condition for its entry into history, that is, into the reign of authenticity. National culture turns towards its past through a relation of defensive negation of European culture. The demand for an anti-colonial national culture stems from the legitimate concern to rediscover the radical unity of the nation through the very discontinuity of its national history, despite the upheavals it has suffered. But if this legitimate return to the cultural past focuses on the past itself without opening it up to the nation's present and future, it risks making us forget the current problems facing the people. The reclamation of the past thus risks becoming a reclamation of the self in the past, and of becoming an operation of idealization and poeticization of the cultural past that's detrimental to national culture itself. So, yeah, this is very interesting. I get the feeling almost like Rosichnère of a kind of attempt to think a form of collective existence culturally that would be beyond the reaffirmation of bourgeois individualism in the last instance. What he calls this, this corpse whose memory we evoke nostalgically. So that I don't know, like I feel as if he's not. Never in Amel's thought have I seen any kind of like vulgar. So he's a very dialectical thinker. It's very subtle here. I like it quite a lot. Do you feel, Ziad, that a lot of this still speaks to conditions facing a country like Lebanon today?
It's hard to say. There's definitely still a fascination with the West. And again, also a past that immobilizes. So perhaps this antagonism is very much still alive. I'm not sure if the means to rupture this are still the same. Cultural practice today is very much not still imbued with the modernist drive it had during Amel's days.
Right, 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 right. In other words, we haven't, and he was right before the onset of kind of mass postmodernization and kind of this imposition
Yeah.
of hyper globalization and all of that. So that would, I mean, one would wonder, one would sort of think how problems like immediacy only become more heightened and things like that. And so there's a lot here that still I think speaks to our present in a certain way. So I mean, I just want to thank you, Ziad, for translating this for us. This is a very rich. Where are you going to publish this?
So it was pitched. I pitched it a few years ago to people who were working on a book on Fanon, the Arab world.
Yeah.
Um, it the book was paused for a second, for well, a couple of years due to the genocide and the war in Lebanon. But I heard it's, I mean, back on
Okay.
track.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully academic time is a beast. So we hope not too long. I just had a collection of essays that I edited.
And just to
Takes
say,
5 years. Yeah.
it's in a book edited by Philip Rizet and will be published by Barzakh Press.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Ziad, for this translation and for your insights, and to everyone else as well. I hope there's nothing that we missed. I thought we did a nice job overviewing this. Um, and let's maybe talk to Nadia about a follow-up as well. I'd like to dig more into Almo's work and learn more about like what types of translations you all have on the horizon as well. I mean, this whole group is very engaged. So really, really a great opportunity, guys. We'll be in touch. All the best. Peace.